Hey guys, Unexceptional Rounder here, and today I'm going to talk about how to adjust to different opponents and how to take effective notes at the table. This is important because not all of your opponents play the same, and some of our greatest profit will come when we discover exploitable patterns that our opponents have. Alright, before I go over the types of opponents, I want to make sure that I'm clear. These are general classifications, and they're really only a starting point. So, with that being said, player type isn't everything. The detailed observations make the most money. And what I mean by that is saying somebody's weak tight is great, but if you take notes on the hand that led you to believe that, it's going to be much more helpful. And if you've got like a heads up display and you can see stats on there on the player, that's great too, but again, that's their overall stats. That doesn't really describe how they play, what types of hands they like, the details that you can make a lot of money off of. And examples are if they slow play, if they check raise, how often is it a bluff, are they reading your hand or just playing their own. These are the types of notes that and observations that really can make you the most money. All right, weak tight players. Let's talk about what they are a little bit here. So, weak tight implies that they play weak. They are not aggressive and they play tight, so they fold a lot. Some of their weaknesses are they fold too often after the flop, they don't bluff enough, and they don't bet for value enough. Some of their strengths are they usually win at showdown. If they're weak and they're tight and they get to showdown, it probably means that they have a really good hand. So how do we exploit this? Well, first of all, we're going to start out by playing in position. We want to play aggressive. We want to try to get heads up, which means that we want to make sure that we're raising to force other players out of the pot. That way we get heads up with the weak tight player we've identified. We can then play against them and exploit their weakness much better because it's only them in the pot. And the way we do that is by being aggressive and forcing them to fold. We also want to use we want to use pot control against them, forcing them to fold, which means we want to be aggressive, we want to bet, we want to not necessarily raise, because if they're actually doing the betting, it's probably a good sign that they might have something, but we want to make bets, we want to build up a big pot to force them into a situation where they have to fold by the turn or river. Loose passive players. So the weakness with loose passive players is that they play too many hands and they call with hands that are weak post flop. They call too much essentially. So they are probably the weakest player, but I guess if they had a strength, it would be they can be difficult to hand read against because they aren't raising a lot. So it's not very effective just to call all the time, but it does make it a little harder to put them on a hand. So how do we exploit this? We want to raise our strong hands. We want to play for big pots when we hit. And a big pot against a loose passive player, or a big hand against a loose passive player, is different than a big hand against a weak tight player or against a loose aggressive player. Against loose passive players, they'll call down sometimes with second pair. They'll call down with weaker hands. They'll call down with draws. When I say, a big hand, sometimes that's even top pair, top kicker. The last thing is, these are not the type of players we want to make bluffs against. What that does mean is we can get a lot of value out of these players, and loose passive players are pretty much the ideal opponent. The more loose passive players at the table, the more money we should be able to make. That brings us to loose aggressive players. Loose aggressive players can be very... some players can get very frustrated by them. They can seem like they're impossible to play against, impossible to read, but you don't really need to, you shouldn't fear them or avoid them or anything like that, because if you're patient and you don't, get tilted, if you lose a big hand, they can actually donate a lot of money to you. What they do is they play a lot of hands, but instead of playing a lot of hands and calling a lot or playing weak a lot, they play a lot of hands and they play them very aggressively, which makes it kind of difficult to play against them. They pressure their opponents. they force folds, and some of them can be very effective at it. But for our purposes, generally at the low stakes, they are not good at it. There's no simple way to put it, but loose aggressive players can be hard to play against, but generally you can kind of figure out what they're doing wrong and exploit them. So how do we do that? We use position. It's much harder to push us off hands, to bluff us, to read our hand when we have position. When you're playing against a lag, which is kind of a term for a loose aggressive player, you want to be in position. You want to play tight, use strong starting hands, and the reason that position is so key, we can use pot control against them. If we don't hit a big hand, we don't have to play for our stack every time we get into a pot. Now, they can always force us to play for our stack, but if we're in position and we use pot control effectively, then we can essentially negate their aggression. We can control the size of the pot, and we can make it so that they don't use pot control against us, forcing us to fold. Let's talk about note-taking a little bit. What I did here is, this is just sort of an example of what some good notes might be, or I also used a bunch of different kinds of shorthand to show how you might take notes. Now, a lot of sites have color codes you can give. A lot of tracking software has color codes or symbols that you can use. And there could be a lot more than this, but I just wanted to show some examples of things that you can do. So again, a lot of this is giving you ideas, improve upon it, use this as kind of a base starting point, and then go from there. Here I've got weak tight marked as a yellow player. So I would, go in, click the little yellow circle, and use that to identify that player. Now, that's good, but what I said earlier was what you really want is specifics. You want to know exactly how you're going to get money from this guy. So when I see hands that are interesting, I want to go ahead and take a note on those things. He flopped a set, and I'll explain some of these abbreviations. So DS I use for double suited, which would mean diamond, diamond, club. All right, double suited, there's 2 different suits. Rainbow is typically 3 different suits. Flopped a set on a double suited board called 3 streets. So what does that tell us? That he's weak, he's weak tight. Usually at some point you're going to raise. Now another like a note at the end of there I could have put is whether or not the flush, if he turned, like the flush turned and the guy bet big or something, but gives you an idea that that might be, hey, that's the hand we saw, and that's why we said, hey, this guy's kind of weak tight. And then maybe later on we saw him fold top pair, good kicker versus a flop raise, and he showed on a 7-8 queen, and he had king queen. He bet, guy raised, and he folded. It's not super, super nitty, but it's kind of weak tight to just get raised and fold. Maybe we know that guy's loose passive, but it's hard to know if that guy knew. Then we've got a note here on this loose passive guy. Loose passive, I almost always use green as the color for that because green, good. Those are the tables I want to play at. He called a 3-bet out of position with 9-10 offsuit. That's worth noting. All right, that's a good note to take. And if you guys saw my last video, I think that guy maybe 3-bet us with 9-10 offsuit. But anyway, calling a 3-bet with 9-10 offsuit is not good. That's not something we need to be doing, especially at the micros. But in general, it's not a good practice to be 3-betting with 9-10 offsuit. And then we also saw him call flop turn with second pair on monotone, no draw. We saw him call the flop and the turn. All he had was second pair, and the flop was monotone, meaning, it was all diamonds. And so I made a note that he didn't have the draw. And then, I kind of just threw in, like, sometimes I'll put there, in there something like, do not bluff this guy. Just something that tells me how to play against him. I mean, that's helpful too. Like, don't bluff this guy, calls anything, value town, whatever you want to put there. Just to remind yourself, to reinforce when you've got that, like, inkling of, like, maybe I could take him off this hand. Like, oh, wait, in big, bold letters here, it says, don't bluff this guy. We didn't talk about tight aggressives, but we've been talking about it for the last 4 PowerPoints. Tight aggressives are very difficult to exploit. Therefore, you should definitely mark them so but then with a tight aggressive player, you really need to get into the detail. What I did is I went in and I said, here are some details you might notice. Floated out of position with overs. And then I said ×2, as in like I saw him do it twice. That's good information to have, right? He could be a tight aggressive player, playing tight pre-flop and playing aggressive. But if we notice, hey, this guy, he'll raise from middle position, get called on the button, check, call the button's bet on the flop, and then flat call, and all he has is overs, and we've seen him do it a couple times. That's exploitable. That's an exploitable thing that we now kind of know about him. So we want to make a note. That way we can use that to get his money. And then like calls 3-bets loose in position. The loose passive guy, he's calling 3-bets out of position real loose. This guy, not as bad, but we should know, hey, if we're going to 3-bet him in position, if we're going to 3-bet while we're out of position, be prepared for him to call. And also that means don't hesitate to 3-bet our value hands, because he might call a little bit light when he's in position. Some things like that. I put the orange color because it's like, hey, orange is, just the solid player color that I use a lot of times. And then loose aggressive. Some people like to go with, like, depending on if they're a good loose aggressive or a bad loose aggressive, but I figure red's fine, means they're aggressive. I pay attention to it. Some people like to put tags as red because it shows, oh, this is bad, stay away from this table. But there's a lot of really bad tag players, a lot of bad tight aggressive players. There's good loose aggressive players. I just look at it as pick your colors, whatever they are, whatever makes sense to you, and go with it. Try to keep it consistent. How do we know the guy's loose aggressive? This is important too, because it's one thing to say, hey, this is the type of thing, but here, what I try to do is show, here are some things that you might observe that tell you if the guy's loose aggressive. If he 4-bet folds, that may not seem like it's that interesting, but somebody bets into you, you raise them, they bet again, you shove all in, and all of a sudden they fold. Like, whoa, that should be kind of surprising. When somebody 4-bets and then you shove all in, you're usually sitting there with like aces or kings going, all right, well, we'll see what he has. It's either ace, king, or aces. Oh, well, here we go. I hope I got lucky. And then the guy turns around and folds, and you're like, what was he doing that way? What did he just 4-bet me and then decide to fold with? He's an aggressive player. He thought maybe you were 3-betting light, so he 4-bet light. If a guy's 4-betting light, that's pretty loose and aggressive. If he's calling out of the blinds a lot, loose aggressive players will, raise out of the blinds or call out of the blinds, but that could be a weakness that you can exploit. He check raises the flop constantly. This is another thing. Maybe they're calling in the blinds, but then they're check raising the flop. It's really specific, but maybe that's something they think they can exploit people with. If you notice, hey, this guy calls the button and he calls the cutoff, he check raises the flop all the time to take these pots down. Well, if that guy knows that those guys are raising weak and he can flat and they'll c-bet and he can raise and take it away a lot, that's a pretty good play. He's exploiting other players, but if we notice that, we can use it to exploit him. I hope that helps. Note-taking is a learned skill. Hopefully this kind of gets you guys on track and shows you some of the things you can do. I'm going to try to wrap this up quickly. You can't be successful at the higher levels without this skill. When you watch higher levels of poker, the plays that get made that you can't always justify is because of reads. People have reads on other people, and that's why you see crazy plays that don't make any sense to you. You got to learn to do it. The better you can do it, the easier time you're going to have, and the more fun you're going to have. It's really fun when you have a good read on someone. It doesn't happen that often, and it kind of makes me think it's something that I really need to work on with my game, because when it happens, it's really nice. It's fun, and it makes you enjoy the game more. Again, I said at the beginning, the general categories that's your start. I gave you a foundation, a starting point, but drill down. Don't just say, oh, this guy, he hasn't played a hand in 15 rounds, so he's tight, probably weak. I'm going to put the yellow dot on him and then never really make another note. That's good. I mean, it's a good start, but you got to do more than that. You got to do a little better than that. Figure out why he's tight. Is he playing 20 tables, Or is he one of these guys that all he does is he looks at the board, figures out what hand beats him, and then if he can't beat that, he folds. Another thing, the more you take notes, the better you'll get at it. And so I would challenge anyone that watches this, try playing one table for an hour and, take a note on every hand that sees a flop. Not every, you don't need to take a note. Button raise, blinds fold. That doesn't really help. But, it helps if you take a note like raise late position, c-bet flop, raise late position, c-bet flop. If after an hour you're like, man, that happened 6 times. That guy's playing pretty, aggressive in late position, and he's c-betting almost every hand. Note the times he checks. He checked back when an ace hit, and then he raised the turn on a blank. Maybe he's the type of guy that checks his aces when he hits, because he thinks, my opponent's not going to call a lot, so I'm going to check back my aces, try to get a little more value out of it. Until next time, this is Unexceptional Rounder. You guys keep on grinding.